So I was actually working on a Dragon Ball video, but with the most recent episode in Bleach, I kind of feel legally obligated to talk about Renji a bit. Spoilers, by the way, but in the most recent episode of the Thousand Year Blood War, Renji had his fight against Uryu, and he finally got to show what his new Bankai was made of. And now Renji seems to be getting his respect from the community. But one thing that I've noticed that I really want to talk about is that not only are people underestimating Renji, but they're also saying that this is what makes him captain level. Now, obviously that's not everyone. And honestly, it's pretty understandable because there's a lot of people who haven't watched Bleach in like 10 years aside from, the Thousand Year Blood War coming out. But Renji has technically been captain level for a minute now. And currently he is well above the strength of a normal captain. You see, captains vary in strength quite a lot even from the very beginning of the series. There seems to be this minimum requirement for being captain level. And while there's no exact way for us, the viewer, to know what this level is, it's much lower than most people think it is. Ichigo was stated to have spiritual pressure at the level of a captain before he even had his Bankai training by Ukitake, which is something that I wish I put in my Chad video because it just further cements that. But anyway, this might seem a bit weird because this Ichigo was no match for Byakuya, but like I said, captains vary a lot in strength. By this point in time, Byakuya was already well above the level that you would need to be considered a captain. And I would say that most captains are pretty well above this level that you need to be. It's kind of like if you know anything about Pokemon, how gym leaders have to be a certain level in order to test trainers, but there's no limit on how strong you have to be as a gym leader because it's just a position and some of them are at the level of a champion. It's really the same thing here. But based off of Soul Society's own standards, Renji should have been captain level at least since Hueco Mundo. Aside from Sasakibe, at that point in time, he was easily the strongest lieutenant. When he had his fight with Ichigo would have died if it wasn't for his hollow mask. And then on top of it, he gained the Bankai, which got schooled by Byakuya, but we know that Byakuya is well above the level of a normal captain. Now fast forward to the Hueco Mundo arc, it's actually a little hard to scale him here, because unlike characters like Ichigo, Chad, and Uryu who fought against Privarone, who I talked about being captain level in my last video, Renji had a very awkward fight against Sailaporo. You see, Sailaporo antied his Bankai, then jumped him with Fraction, and then Uryu showed up and it became a 2v1. And then they both lost to his resurrection, so then Mayuri came in and saved them. It was definitely a roller coaster of a fight, but there's a few important details that we can actually get from this. For starters, it's implied that Renji with his Bankai would have actually been able to fight pretty well against Sailaporo, because he specifically stated that the difference between him and his Shikai was too great. This is actually very important, because Toshiro was not able to do anything to Yami with his Shikai, and it was the same situation, with the only differences being that Renji actually did manage to injure Sailaporo a little bit, and base Sailaporo is stronger than base Yami. Now, I'm not trying to say that this Renji is stronger than that Toshiro, but I am going to point out that he had a similar showing to a captain who I wouldn't even say is the weakest captain at that point in time. And then from here on, it actually gets a little awkward because Renji doesn't actually have that many significant fights as I thought he did. Maybe that's just because when I watched Bleach, I didn't know what filler was back then, so, I remembered him fighting a lot more. We do know that he had a pretty significant power-up going into, the Fullbring arc time skip. However, he fought against an opponent that was so much weaker than him that we couldn't really tell anything from it. But my point is that at the very least, he has been captain level minimum for a while now. I mean, Shikai Ichigo in the Soul Society arc was considered captain level, right? And he was getting dogged on by a base Privarone, let alone a base Espada. And this is probably a pretty good time for me to explain that when I talk about captain levels, in my mind I picture them into 3 different groups. I have the low end captains who are like Soul Society arc Tosin and Hitsugaya and Komamura, right? And then I have the middle road captains where I put Byakuya and Gin, and then the high end captains are the elder captains like Shunsui, Unohana, Ukitake, Aizen, and then obviously Yamamoto is above them, right? I put the bridge between the middle and the low end is Soifon, but I would say that Renji is pretty clearly, before Thousand Year Blood War, in that area with Komamura and Hitsugaya, right? Now, you have to keep in mind that a lot of these captains grow as well, right? Tosin has a big growth in power in the Hueco Mundo arc, and then, same with Byakuya. Byakuya also gets much stronger from his Soul Society arc counterpart. There are a lot of captains or characters from the Soul Society arc, right, that I feel like Renji in the Fullbring arc would have pretty comfortably fought even with, if not beaten, that we used to think of as strong, but people still think of Renji at this point as is weak. And it's really just the vibe, honestly. Like, I can't blame anyone. He doesn't give off the same vibe at that point in time because he didn't have a very good track record of winning his fights. But 1000-Year Blood War arc Renji is a whole different beast. I mean, not only is his new Bankai, like, significantly better than his old one, right? But even base Renji at this point in time was extremely powerful. Like, it makes me think, like, what were they feeding this man for him to get this much of a boost? Because after his training at the Royal Palace, his first fight is against Masked and Masculine. And for some reason, people tend to forget how much of a beast this guy actually was. So let's go over it real quick. He beat the equivalent of 3 lieutenants and then 2 captains right in a row without using the full extent of his Shrift and without using his Volstern dish, which means that he beat 2 captains easily without going full power of the equivalent of his Shikai. But then when Renji fights him, he uses the full power of his Shrift, he goes into his Volstern dish, and he uses his ultimate attack on Renji. And he also healed before the fight, so he was going into it 100%. And he literally did no damage to Renji at all. And then Renji hit him with like 2 moves, broke his arm in one, and then one-shot him in the second one, which is pretty much the definition of a no-diff, because Renji did better against the stronger version of an opponent with his Shikai than 2 captains and 3 lieutenants did, or at least lieutenant equivalents. This right here would have already put Renji above the mid-level captains and closing in on that like elder level. Now, not quite yet, right? But like approaching it, kind of like how I have Soifon as like an in-between the mid and the low, right? But unfortunately, this was the last fight that he had in the manga, or at least the last real fight he had. But with the anime, we finally get to see what he's actually capable of. Now, I will say from here on, there is going to be a spoiler warning, especially because of Uryu, right? I'm going to talk about a little bit of him from the manga that the anime hasn't covered yet, so be aware of that. But Renji's fight with Uryu has really showed us 2 things. One is that he is extremely powerful because of the fact that he was even able to injure Uryu, right? And 2 is that his Bankai is extremely versatile. Usually, I'm one of the first people who will defend a Bankai like Soifon's, right? Like, you will never convince me that being able to summon a nuke on command is a bad ability. But it's Bankais like Renji's that'll make me question that. Because Renji has range, defense, tactical abilities, multiple nukes. I mean, he can use the equivalent of his old Bankai, he can shoot out his beams, he has close range attacks, he has a big arm for melee. Like, he has so many things in his bag now, it's just so insane because his old Bankai was so lackluster. And he has the strength to back it up too, because not only did he have Uryu kind of shook at multiple moments within the fight, right? But he also pushed him to use his Volstern dish and injured him enough to make him heal himself with Skyvar. Uryu even states that some of the reasons why Renji lost was that he was unconsciously holding back as to not kill Uryu, and that Renji was unaware of his abilities, which matters a lot when you consider the fact that Uryu actually beat him by draining his spiritual pressure. Meaning that Renji was easily relative to Uryu in this fight, and that is no small feat, considering the fact that Uryu is on a generational run right now. Uryu's last 2 fights, which he won by the way, were against an unrestrained Squad Zero member, and Ichigo, the main character. Now, there was definitely some shenanigans afoot in these fights, right? But we're gonna go over that real quick, because while he beat Senjumaru by using his Shrift, the Antithesis, right? Very hacks ability, which at the moment I don't believe he used in his fight against Renji. But it's also true that during his fight against Senjumaru, he didn't use his Volstern dish. Or he did use what looks to be like an incomplete form of his Volstern dish to break out a part of her Bankai, but definitely not on the same refined level that he did against Ichigo and Renji. So while he had used a hack's ability to beat Senjumaru that he didn't use against Renji, he actually used more raw power against Renji than he did against the Squad Zero member. And in his fight against Ichigo, it's true that Ichigo was holding back even more so than Renji was. It's also true that Uryu was powerful enough to injure, put pressure on, and even clash with Ichigo. A version of Ichigo who is as powerful as he was during his fight with Aizen, and was able to completely overpower a base Yhwach before he used his Almighty. And who knows, maybe we'll see Renji do more in episodes later to come, right? But in my opinion, this is more than enough info to place him in the upper ends of captains. In fact, while I went into this video just assuming that I would put him at the higher end, like near Unohana and Shunsui and Ukitake, right? Thinking about it now, off of everything I've just said and everything I've seen, is it too much of a stretch to say that Renji could honestly be head captain material? Like, I'm not saying he's as strong as someone like Yamamoto, right? But can you picture someone like Shunsui fighting against Uryu, who was able to kill Senjumaru, and was able to put up a good fight, if not, well, more than a good fight against Ichigo, who was able to overpower base Yhwach. Do you think that Shunsui could defeat base Yhwach? Maybe with his Bankai, which is kind of hacks, right? But at least in terms of raw power and spiritual energy and pressure, right? I think Renji might even outclass Shunsui as a head captain. I know that's kind of crazy to say, and that was not my intention when I was making this video, but just thinking about it now, I don't think that's a stretch anymore. Especially considering the fact that I believe it was Core 2, last Core, when Unohana was talking to Kenpachi about his, like, worthy rivals. It showed Byakuya, Ichigo, and Renji. And I'm gonna be honest, I believe it now, because Kenpachi is also in that upper echelon, in that high level of head captain status power, right? And I think Renji might be there too. And if not, very close. Then again, I might not be giving Shunsui enough credit. He was strong enough to fight against Leo Barrow, and he was able to decimate a Squad Zero member. Not an understrain member, but you get my point. Shunsui is a little hard to scale. But regardless, Renji is absolutely one of the strongest members of the Gotei 13. And he is now strong enough to be relevant in basically every single combative situation within Bleach. With the only characters who you can really say are head and shoulders above someone like that would be Yhwach, Ichigo, Aizen, Ichibei, Yamamoto, and then Kenpachi probably as well. Excluding immortal hack sequences that we didn't get to see enough of.